All those things.
All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Talk Recovery Radio. You're listening to us live here in Facebook land. And if you're listening to us on the radio, you're listening to us on 100.5 FM. And my name is Giuseppe Ganci, my co-host, Mr. Darren Gaylor. Hey, Darren, how's it going?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm well. I'm coping with our new, what do you call it, new lifestyle with COVID restrictions coming back in. So not living in fear, but definitely at this stage of the game, I'm like hands up. I'm going to wear a mask. I'm going to social distance the best I can. I'm just not playing, the theories out there. I just want it to end. I just want us to have a big Christmas, and I just want us to have a good 2021.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
Chris, I just want to go to Mexico.
I know. I want to go on a trip too. So, you're watching us on Facebook here. You can catch all of our replays at SoundCloud and iTunes. We've been on the air for 7 years. Yay. Hundreds of guests, thousands of listeners. Thank you to everybody that's involved with supporting Talk Recovery Radio. It's always a pleasure. Darren, they raised $40,000 for the fundraiser for Co-op Radio. So to everyone that's donated, to anyone that's donated in part for Talk Recovery Radio, that's awesome. Thank you very much. This whole radio station is put on by its members, so we appreciate everybody out there. Usually we have a hot topic that we talk about, but we had a bit of a late start today. My apologies out there. So we're just going to get right into the interview. We interview guests from around the world, all pathways to recovery from addiction, because there's just as many pathways out there as there are people. And today we've got a great guest, a world expert I like to refer to. Darren, who are we talking recovery with today?
Yes, we get to talk recovery with Dr. Claudia Black. Her work with children impacted by substance abuse in the late 70s created the foundation for the adult child movement. She is a renowned author, speaker, trainer, internationally recognized for her work with family systems and addictive disorders. And I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with you as a result of the books on my mom's bookshelf, which is fantastic. Her looking into family, systems and all of that really helped her sort of get out of my way and just see it in a broader perspective, and it helped her immensely. So thank you very much for that, and welcome to the show, Dr. Claudia Black.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. And as we said when we started, there are a lot of different pathways into the recovery process, and one of those pathways is for adult children to be taking a look at their issues. One of those pathways is parents sometimes have their own recovery, so that influences their own kids' recovery. And it's not just recovery from addictions, it's recovery from the consequences of oftentimes growing up with addiction. Right. Pleasure for me to be here.
Yay.
Which I'm so glad we have the full hour with you, because, this isn't just a very specific topic. It's so complex. As I'm trying to come up with my questions, I can't help but sort of be somewhat generalized, because I think of all our listeners, all our viewers, and I don't know if it was a result of the pandemic, but personally, I've been getting phone calls just through my own shared experience, mostly from parents. What do I do? And I think maybe their child's behaviors and what they're getting into is coming a little bit closer to home as a result of this pandemic. I'm not sure. And it's so hard to give advice to parents. So I want to start there. This might be a general question, but what do parents say? When do they have the talk about drugs? How straightforward? I mean, I know this is a broad question, but can we talk about that? Like, when's the right time?
I think the right time actually begins when they're very, very young. And, there's ways that one, in terms of parenting, there's healthy parenting that we need to begin with when they're very young. But in terms of talking, these kids are exposed to the possibility of using when they're 8, 9, and 10 years of age. So we need to be talking with them about it at 8, 9, and 10 years of age. And one of the things the research is showing is that kids respond positively when parents have open discussions. And I think in the moment, it doesn't feel like that. But we know that from a prevention standpoint, the more parents talk with their kids about their concerns, that those kids really are listening. If nothing else, even if they start to dabble, and they will, in their young teenage years, if not earlier than that, they've had this conversation where that parent was able to talk about something in a non-judgmental way. I think when it comes to what's happening with our young adults and our older teenagers, particularly our young adults with the pandemic, is they've been out of the home. They're out of the home living somewhere else. A lot of the time they may be away at school. And it's so easy for these young adults to have secrets, that their relationship with their parents is all on text now. And suddenly they are home, and you've got a kid who's a serious depression, their anxiety is all over the place, and their drug use and their need to use, because that's what addiction is about, is that need to use is such that they're lying and they're manipulating their parents, and suddenly parents see something that they didn't see there. And so when it comes to talking to kids, if we haven't begun some of these conversations earlier in life, it's so much more difficult at this point. And there's so many other additional concerns with COVID. But I think one of the biggest messages people need to hear in this 1 hour is, if somebody's in trouble, get some help, because that help is still available in spite of the pandemic. And not to discount your perceptions. We're seeing kids, I oversee a young adult program, and they are imploding when they get home. And the parents are seeing things that truly have been going on for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And the parents were unaware of it, because that young adult is so good at hiding. And I want to say about talking to kids, you can talk to kids about any aspect of addiction. It's just about putting it into their terminology. I can talk about denial with kids. I can talk about being out of control. But we not only want to talk about what happens in active addiction, for those who are parents in recovery, you get to talk about recovery. One of the things people worry about is the relapse issue. And if you're in recovery, chances are there was some relapse and the kids saw it. So what you need to have a conversation is who's responsible if it happens again. But what they need to hear is about what you're doing to be accountable in your recovery. This is why I go to meetings. This is why I get on a Zoom. This is why I see the therapist, so I can be more honest, so I can be accountable, and to not be afraid of those kinds of conversations. I may be talking too much here.
No, not at all. No.
And that's just it, isn't it? With, what is it about these conversations that we'd rather avoid? And I'm a parent now of a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. And I mean, I'm 14 years into my recovery. I'm sure if I was 6 months into my recovery, or actively, I would have a completely different perspective. I'd probably want to, sort of avoid this conversation, avoid, keeping it out there in front of them. It would be a secret. And
let me say a couple of things. If your kids are really young, 2 and 4, it's not even about the conversation as much as it's about your behavior.
That's right.
And one, please, listeners, understand, if your kids are 2 and 4 and they've been impacted by active addiction, it's been a part of their family system, they have been influenced. So the kinds of behaviors you look for is when you say, I'm going to go out to the store and I'll be back in 10 minutes, you're back in 10 minutes. You are accountable as a healthy parent. And that's really hard when you're in early recovery, because you're barely able to, be accountable to anything. And you're probably struggling with other kinds of life issues. But about a conversation, you don't need to have at that age. It's really about behavior and messages you give them. They need to have the message that you're the one taking responsibility for yourself. They don't have to take responsibility for them. And it will take time to develop some healthy parenting practices, because most people maybe, who become addicted weren't raised with the healthiest of families, so they don't know what healthy parenting is. Yeah. Now, when it comes to kids being a little bit older in those conversations, there's just the great, who are you to talk to me about this? Because look at you, I know what your history was. Right. And again, I was just saying this earlier, your job is to be the best parent, not to be the best friend. and to know that you don't have to feel guilty for what your past behavior was about.
Yeah.
And you need to feel good about your recovery and to come from a place of strength in these conversations.
And that is such a difficult place to be. Oftentimes it's that best friend role, that parent that lets their kids and their buddies come into the basement, smoke a joint, have a few drinks because they're under the protection, and it's not being hidden, which is sort of a positive. Or there's this, you cannot do this, demanding, controlling, line that's pushing their child probably away. And how do you get in that middle? How do you find that spot where you're not the friend and you're not the bully, controlling parent? Like, that's the secret, isn't it?
It's healthy boundaries is not about limit setting is about having healthy boundaries, and that could be a distortion in how you perceive. If I set healthy boundaries for my kids to say, it's not okay. It's not okay to drink and use. I mean, we have laws, and you don't get to drink and use until you're 18 years of age. And, I want to support you by getting involved in a lot of healthy activities. And if you do such and such, there'll be choices and consequences. But we don't want to do that. And it often has to do with our own emotional lack of recovery around a couple different issues. So let me identify those.
Okay.
If you're having a hard time really setting appropriate limits and boundaries, then it's often our fear of rejection, our need for acceptance, our fear of conflict and anger. And those are issues you need to go address that have nothing to do with this child. They're usually family of origin issues where you never got the approval, where you internalized your own real self-acceptance. The last thing you want to do is have conflict because maybe there was too much conflict and it was very traumatic for you. But those are parts of your own personal recovery that are going to be absolutely critical. Now, I happen to know I'm here today to talk about a book that will never happen to me, but I want to mention to the parents, I have a book called Straight Talk, and it's in a new edition. And Straight Talk is about how recovering parents can talk to their children as they're raising them, but also what if they're 25 and 30 years of age today? Maybe those kids don't want to have that conversation. They don't really want to have the conversation at 16. So behaviorally, what do we do? But again, setting limits for your kids is not about dominating and controlling. It's about providing structure and having healthy expectations. And that's your job as a parent. And sometimes we don't want to be that parent. We feel vulnerable. We still are working through our own issues of shame and adequacy regarding ourselves. But there's programs in which to work through those issues.
So there's two stories.
I also want to say, go ahead.
There's two stories here. There's the story of the parents, you're the parent and you're in recovery. And then there's the story of you're the children of people that are in recovery. And so I wanted to talk about the parents being in recovery first, and then we can talk about the kids. So a lot of parents, what suggestions do you have? They're in early recovery. There's this whole conversation of, being the best parent. I'm going to stay sober for my kids, but yet you see so many people entering rehab with kids. What do you make? How do you suggest priorities? Like, do I fix my kid? Do I fix the relationship with my kids on the get-go? Do I wait a bit? Because so many moms out there are just, do I go to rehab for 6 months and not see my kid? How can we support people that have kids, younger kids especially, and not dismissing older kids don't have the issues, but how do we get a mother or father to really understand, like, take time? Should they take time, take care of you, and still love your kids, but like take care of you? Because it's such a hard issue.
That is hard. It's really hard. They need to embrace their recovery first and foremost, because if you don't have your recovery, you will not be a good mother. You will not be a good father. And one of the problems sometimes that people have in early recovery is their expectations of wellness. And recovery takes time. Knowing what a healthy boundary is, coming to like yourself, letting go of your guilt and shame. And it's so hard for parents with children in terms of the guilt and the shame that they've had, but you're going to have a chance to repair that. But you're only going to have a chance to repair that if you get sound recovery practices and can maintain that recovery process. I also want to say about children will be very forgiving if they see you acting in a more responsible way, and that you're not going to be able to make up, overnight, but you will be able to make up if you've got that strong recovery that goes on. And it's very hard when parents are on treatment, in particular if you're the primary parent, and I think for mothers who often are. And again, whatever kind of recovery practice you're in, ideally there's going to be some way in which you have access to your children, and they need to know they're going to be able to withstand some physical separation if they know what you're doing. To work on yourself. One of the things that I'm doing is working on myself so I will be a better parent. And they're the first to tell you, oh, Mom, you've been a great parent, but that's not true. So, and I'm working to be a better parent. And what that means is when you want to tell me a story, I'm going to be there and listen to that story. Or when you come home from school and you're upset, I'm going to be able to pay attention to you. I won't be passed out on the couch. Be very specific with them. And, they will be more patient than you think.
And now
again, it's unrealistic expectations.
For the parents that are in recovery, a big fear is my kid's going to be an addict. Oh my God, they're smoking weed. Oh my God, they're going to smoke heroin next week. Any suggestions for parents that are going through that right now? It's like my kid's just turning into a teenager, scared to death.
Well, first of all, it could happen. It might happen. They're more prone to addiction than anybody else, but it doesn't have to happen. And if it does happen, I want to say you're modeling two things if you're in recovery. You're modeling that it's okay to ask for help, and you're modeling that people can change. And do not forget those two things should that happen. By your own behavior, people can change, and it's okay to ask for help. And should, again, they be already struggling, and maybe possibly even addicted, this is where learning how to set structure and have choices and consequences, and that's where practicing good Al-Anon principles is really going to come into being. But back to the question, just that fear. They are more prone, they could be more genetically loaded, that in and of itself is hard, but it also happens a lot to do with their environment, what's been modeled for them about how you cope with stress, etc. Again, this goes back to being the best parent. We have various forms of emotional abandonment that will go on when you're raising kids when there's addiction. And it's about no longer abandoning them. It's okay for them to have their feelings. Their needs are becoming more important now. It's not just about your needs. It's okay if they make a mistake. These are the kinds of messages we need to start giving our kids that, in fact, they have oftentimes never heard. And we do that verbally with them, but we also have to do that behaviorally with them. While you're more prone to become an addict if a parent is an addict, typically that's true for about 1 out of every 4. Now, what you don't want to do is forget what happens to those other 4, because their own, what we call A.C.O.A issues, can fuel their getting into relationships with, or can just fuel their depressions and their anxieties. They're going to ultimately need their own recovery, and the younger they are when you get sober, the more your recovery will influence it. But if they're teenagers and adults, chances are they're going to need to do some counseling, some therapy, some self-help work somewhere along the way. Yeah. And you can support them.
I remember going to meetings, for a while now, over a decade, and I've seen children grow up in the rooms. They go to the meetings with their moms, and they're like, 6, 7 years old, and now they're like 12, 13, or some of them are 50s, and you find out like they're going to a youth program, and you're like, but you've been going to meetings your whole life. Like, didn't you listen to anything? It's always, one of those things you just never know what path someone's going to take, and preparing for it, as from what I'm hearing you say, is the best way to deal with it, is be prepared. And I think that's just—
and be prepared that it could happen. I see a lot of that too, kids growing up in the rooms. And sometimes, that's necessary because of their lack of childcare, but I'm not a real proponent of that. One is kids need to be with kids. They don't need to be with a bunch of adults. Sometimes those adults aren't exactly, the best representation of mental health stages of recovery. And I think that sometimes the implication is if they hear enough, they will make sure it doesn't happen to them. And that buys into the willpower concept, that they'll have the willpower. They've seen enough, they know enough. I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to me. And after all, I've seen all these other people, listen to them. And we have to remember it isn't about willpower. It's going to have a lot to do with emotional recovery and how they experience that with the people that they are surrounded with.
Right. Like what kind of resiliency does that young person have in the face of hardship, rather than just how many meetings they've gone to while sort of growing up. And so that comes back to the title of your book, It Will Never Happen to Me, Growing Up with Addiction as Youngsters, Adolescents, Adults. So what you've just said, 1 out of every 4, it won't happen to them. So
3 out of every 4 it won't happen to them.
Yeah, right. 3 out of every 4, it won't happen to them. But based on that willpower ideology that they have, that certainty that they're not going to do it because they've seen it. They've seen the poor behavior, the misuse, and all of that. That not necessarily that's a good thing. They may remain like sober or clean individuals, but how much other baggage will they then have? Like is it going to be a relationship, sort of symptom, unhealthy relationships, intimacy? Is that what we're going to see from the kids that it doesn't happen to?
From the kids that it doesn't happen to, you'll often see unhealthy relationships because there's been a lack of modeling of what a healthy relationship is. So also you see a lack of intimacy because even if I find somebody who's pretty healthy and I'm in a relationship, I still don't trust oftentimes. I don't have a sense of my own inadequacy oftentimes. See a lot of depression that will show up later in life. When I say later, in their 30s and their 40s, not necessarily later than that. I see a lot of anxiety, and all of that affects them in various areas of their life. Sometimes those problems will show up more in relationships. Sometimes they'll show up more as a parent. Sometimes they'll show up more in the work setting. They can unfortunately permeate every aspect of our life. And I also want to say, you use the word resiliency, which is really important. I grew up in this kind of home, and I know you did, and it's very likely, you have as well, Giuseppe. And I had a lot of resiliency, but I also had a lot of issues I had to attend to. And we don't want to discount the strengths that kids do develop. And I will talk about this, and it will never happen to me. We develop, for me, I developed good leadership ability because if I didn't lead in this household, nobody was going to take charge of a whole lot of things, just basic day-to-day functioning, because parents were so available. So it's important to know what the strengths are. But what happens is we go into our adult life sort of tapping ourselves on the back for how well we've done in spite of, consciously or unconsciously, and we don't realize what we didn't learn. And it's what we didn't learn that gets us into trouble. Like maybe I didn't learn conflict resolution. I didn't learn how to negotiate. Maybe I didn't learn how to stand side by side with somebody on an equal basis. Those are the things that ultimately will cause difficulty. And I want to say 2 more things now that one of you speak, but I love your questions. When it comes to resiliency of young children, because maybe you're influencing a child who's still in an active home, there's 2 particular factors that help kids stay resilient, is for them to have a sense of success or mastery over some area of their life. And they'll often find that in the school setting, somewhere in the community. A sense of mastery could be something that is academic. It could be something in the arts. It could be something, with dance, music, etc. So they can feel good about themselves. The other thing that supports kids in resiliency is having at least one person that was significant in their life that gave them messages that gave them a sense of value. Now, that's often an extended family member. It's many times somebody, again, in the community. could be somebody in their schools. But when I ask that in an audience, everybody is able to tell me that there was at least this one person. And I ask them, what was that message? You can do anything you want. You are important. It's okay to take a healthy risk. It's okay if you make a mistake. That's going to be really important for these kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah, especially important about making a mistake. What do you say to parents? I work in a treatment center. Darren was a colleague of mine here too, and it's a case where parents are not open about their recovery. It's like they want to keep it to themselves and they don't want to burden their children with knowing that mommy was a heroin addict or daddy was an alcoholic. And sometimes I feel that that's not the best case scenario. Should we just leave it to people on their own? Do you have any suggestions in that conversation?
Yes, usually, one, I've seen a lot of parents like that. Not too long ago, I was working with a man who was a physician, and he said, my kids never saw me drinking, so why would I tell them I've been to an addiction treatment program? But what the kids did see is they experienced his absence. And I just want to say, in talking to parents about this, usually I say, as hard as that is, your kids know that something's wrong. They know that something has been amiss, and they will feel a greater sense of hope by knowing that you are attending to this. And secrecy only creates distance in families. So again, if the kids are young, you don't have to go into great detail. You're not doing your fifth step with your kids. They don't even actually have to know, depending on their age, it may be more appropriate as they get older, but when they're young, they don't have to know exactly what you were using. They don't have to know the damage and the collateral of your drug use. It can be simple. I go to these meetings because, I've been using and putting things into my body that aren't good for me. And by going to these meetings, this is what it gives me. Or I go in and see this counselor because, again, I've been in. And kids just are not stupid. I think it's really appropriate to say I've been using chemicals to make me feel better, and I don't want to do that anymore because it gets in the way of my being available to you. And my hope is that you won't do that either. And then you talk about, how life can be different if we don't put chemicals into our body. So you don't have to be graphic. You can talk about chemicals, things that aren't good for me. I didn't learn ways in which to make myself feel good, so I've used substances. You can use that word. And as you become more comfortable in your own skin with being a recovering person, it becomes easier.
It's funny because working in the field allowed my own ignorance of, the typical, abused child or neglected child, the child that propped their passed out parents' head up and put the blanket on top of them, that saw the drug use, that, the typical, that's why you're an addict. I've also seen the same outcome of a child with parents that were successful, doctors, lawyers, and that is I guess can be said as unhealthy as the active addiction. That family dynamic that presents itself as perfect, doesn't make mistakes, that if it's the same outcome, then it's just as problematic as the using parents. Is this true to say?
It is absolutely true to say, and I see that a lot. I cannot tell you the number of young people say, well, I don't have any trauma in my family. I had the perfect family. I have the perfect parents. And then I've got, a 22-year-old here, suicidal, major depression, and trouble with their addiction with the law. And what makes that more problematic is it's more subtle. The dynamics that have been traumatic in the context of the family is sometimes more what didn't happen versus what did happen.
That's right.
What you're talking about are very blatant traumas that are more visible. And in some of these families, that are really engaged in a lot of image management in spite of how active the addictions are. And we can have lots of addictions, sex addictions, gambling addictions, substance addictions. Image management is, we know what goes on in this family, but nobody else is going to see that. And oftentimes we may not know what's going on. We just know there's something very wrong in this family. And the kinds of subtleties are really when it's not okay to make a mistake, when you have a lot of perfectionism going on in the family, when you have a lot of controlling behavior going on in the family. That's so much more subtle than blatant neglect or parents who are passed out. Severe criticizing. People
Right.
don't take accountability for themselves. They blame each other. And again, a lot more subtle. You know, it wasn't as bad for me. I don't even know why I'm in here. Look at this guy's life. You know, you get a
Exactly.
lot of that. And I always say that one person's loss is never to be negated because somebody else has a worse horror story. There is always somebody with a worse horror story. Right about the time I think I heard the most horrific things, somebody else is going to walk in. So when the losses are more subtle, that doesn't negate the impact it's had on you.
Yeah, and I think that is an important message, for parents to be able to model some fallibility and imperfection, and like you say, the mistakes that can humanize a parent. So when the child does make a mistake, it's not this fear of such judgment, like you say, criticism for having made the mistake, and they might be more open to offer the story and tell the truth and ask for help from the parents that they know and they've seen also make mistakes. I guess I mean that's just one of so many dynamics that you've seen over the years. From the late 70s and on your research and all the countless families that I'm sure you've worked with, what are some of the major differences from then to now with children of addicts and alcoholics that you've seen? Does the conversation change? Like, do all your books require revision? Like what are some of the differences that have come about in today's age?
I think that when it came to It Will Never Happen to Me, I was able to flush out the different roles in a way where we see more of the vulnerabilities and not just the strengths, because it's the vulnerabilities that people will pay attention to in their recovery or treatment process. The other thing I did with It Will Never Happen to Me is I really talked more about traumatic stress and the neuroscience of traumatic stress and how this is influencing the depressions and the anxieties and the emotional dysregulation and all of their behavioral acting out. And I did it in a way, I really write to the person that this is impacting. I don't write to the academic. And so it has much more of a trauma lens to it. And I also think that I, in particular, fleshed out more healthy messages that we can give our kids, and which I didn't do in the previous book. I mean, we were revolving over time in terms of when I say messages, I didn't cause it. We want them to understand they didn't cause it, they can't control it, they're not going to be able to cure it, but their job is to communicate. Their job is to make healthy choices for themselves and to be self-compassionate with themselves. So I really fleshed that out. And it was interesting when it came to Straight Talk, because I just recently revised it. One of the biggest elements I changed had to do with children's relationships with screens, the internet.
Yeah.
And the impact that, in terms of just healthy parenting, the responsibility that we need to take with our kids, with how much time they're spending on social media sites in particular, or just in general on YouTubes and all the various places they go. But it's really important for recovering parents too. I mean, it's just a healthy part of parenting to be paying attention to how much time we're sitting here looking like this when our kids over here. And so in many ways, unfortunately, so much of what I have talked about and written about is ageless, and that's sad. But it is the human condition that has not changed as much with culture as what we would think. What any revision does is our language is often changed, and hopefully there is more depth and breadth to those original pieces. When I first wrote It Will Never Happen to Me, I talked about don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, which would really change the course of our work with children of addiction. But there are other dysfunctional family rules. It's not okay to make a mistake. It's one of those. It's not okay to ask for help. So I fleshed that out. And when I talked about, as I say, the roles, I fleshed those out to a greater degree. But there's always room for revisions, usually after 10 or 15 years at least. But unfortunately, when it comes to addiction in the family, a lot of the things are very much the same. Now, maybe today we talk about more process addictions than we used to. We certainly do. And we talk about, sex and relationship addictions and sex, gaming addictions, etc. So that broadens the scope of things.
How does a family deal with forgiveness? So we've got your mother, your
How
father,
does
forgiveness, moving forward,
okay.
forgiveness. So your kid's mad at you. They're choked. You spent the family fortune, and you missed every birthday of mine, and now you want to be friends because you read a step 9 letter to me. Like, go to hell, that kind of stuff. I mean, it happens every day. My kids are still estranged, and it could be a trigger for relapsing. There's kind of this expectation, I think, even in old school, like my mother, for example, like the idea that I would need to forgive my mother for something, it just doesn't exist in our culture. It's like, well, guys should be forgiven every day just because I'm your mom, kind of thing. And I love my mom to pieces if you're watching, but that's just the way our culture is. How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, I always say you don't get to a place of heartful forgiveness at the price of emotional honesty. Now I'm going to say that again because it's complex. You don't get to a place of heartfelt forgiveness at the price of not being able to be emotionally honest, at least with yourself. That doesn't mean this 25, 35-year-old child now has to dump all their emotional honesty on their recovering parent, but they've got to be honest with themselves. Otherwise, they will engage in something that we call false forgiveness, or sometimes called cheap forgiveness. And that's sort of like an intellectual exercise. I will forgive you because I understand that addiction is a disease, but they're not really speaking from the heart because they really haven't been able to get honest with themselves about their own sorrows, their own angers, their own fears, etc. So one is that if I am the recovering person, of course I want to hear my family members say they forgive me. But again, we have to be very careful about expectations, and that they probably, if they're very quick to say, I forgive you, that's probably cheap forgiveness. And that's not what you want. You want to hear it because it makes you feel good in the moment. But it's also not what's going to sustain your recovery process. So the recovering person needs to have some lower expectations that forgiveness comes in time. Kids love their parents, and I haven't said that yet, but it doesn't matter what in the world went on. Kids love their parents, and they really genuinely want to forgive you. And sometimes they're the ones who willingly get into this cheap forgiveness. Of course, I forgive you because I just want you the way you are now, mom or dad. And they usually will have to come back if they want their life to be healthy to address some of those underlying issues. But just know that it's that emotional honesty that's going to get people to a place. And that, it's sad when kids want to hang on to their anger. But they need to hang on to it for a little while because when they don't trust. And a little while may take a little longer for some than for others. One of the things that we do in family programming is you are not here to nail your parents to the wall. And if we can help them, one, to understand what addiction is, that is helpful, that it wasn't willful on their part, that, when you are an addict, you end up violating your values. But your values didn't disappear. And one of those values is you wanted to be the best parent you could, but the addiction took over and didn't allow that to happen. And so that's something that the addicts need to hear, but it's also something that the kids ultimately need to hear at some point. So good family programming can be helpful, even though it may not show the immediate results in terms of helping them to understand what addiction is. For us not to have realistic expectations, they have all the reasons in the world in which to be angry and to still be scared. And to try and get them through that too quickly is going to create false forgiveness.
Yeah, it almost makes the young adult child that can appropriately express their anger towards their parent the perfect sort of model for that parent's recovery. Because sometimes the children that are so young that are just sad and then forgive and are just happy to see mom and dad, it's that it came back too quick, and there's like a lack of appreciation for the harm that's been caused. Yet you know, if the recovering parent can hear truthfully and honestly the hurt, the disappointment, the frustration, the anger from their child, and you know, with some healthy boundaries, saying, no, I'm, you know, I'm not okay just yet, but I'm here, like that,
Yes.
you know, they don't get it all back, but they don't get, you know,
Yes.
completely cut off either.
Yes.
But again, that's where these, you know, this conversation, you know, at some point for the child needs to take place. And so many of us think that it's the person in the rehab that's the only one that needs help. And you know, is that what sort of sprung your Claudia Black Young Adult Center, was just to give those children a place to understand it for themselves, and have these conversations and have these awarenesses? So many of us think the person in the rehab that's the only one that needs help. And why is that coming back?
That's
Sorry.
repeating itself, isn't it?
Yeah,
Maybe if
yeah.
I just talk over it. So little glitch, we call that. I've had a lot of glitches this week, I have to tell you, with doing Zoom. And well, one is, no, the Claudia Black Center is really for young adults who are in trouble with their own addictions, depressions, anxiety, mental health issues. But we have very intimate conversations with they and their parents. When I say intimate, you know, very, very highly structured, they need to be, so nobody gets abused in the process of this conversation. Sometimes it is about some level of confrontation with their parents. But certainly their parents need to also maybe have some level of confrontation with their child as well. But what is true is I came into this field with the belief that nobody deserves to live with the fear and the shame that permeates an addictive family system. And when I say nobody, I mean the young children, adolescent, adult children, partners, spouses, but also the addict. Nobody deserves to live with, as I say, the guilt and the fear and the shame. And that has been a drive of mine for well over 40 years now in this field, as to what can we do to create resources so that our lives don't continue to be driven by something that was so significant at an earlier time in our life.
We got a question from Facebook. Hello, my oldest son always drops everything on me from what happened and what he thought happened to me. And now he's in psychosis in the downtown east side. Don't know what to do. I'm 12 years clean.
Okay. One is we have something called internal boundaries, and you will get kids who now, as an adult, you know, have hung on to that anger and will not take responsibility for themselves and will want to continually blame you for not being the parent they needed you to be. And your internal boundary really comes with, in my recovery, this is what I have attempted to do, and he's not been able to receive it. So you need to really pay attention to your own recovery skills and your own recovery efforts. And at the point that he has psychosis going on, that could be drug induced, it could be mental health, but you need to not let your guilt that he has attempted to put on you and to hold you, to not have the appropriate now external boundaries and leverage in terms of how much are you willing to get involved in the finances, how much are you willing to get involved in what he does after this kind of placement. Is that helpful? Does that respond?
Yeah, well, we'll
I'm asking Gillespie and Darren here.
I can only imagine and attempt to empathize with that situation. And again, my perspective has changed since having kids of my own, as far as like what I would do in these circumstances. It would take a lot for me to not drive down there myself and circle the blocks, no matter whether I'm being triggered or not. And I mean, it's changed my whole offering of advice in sometimes these situations. But I think what you just said is pretty much the only thing that can be said. in that circumstance.
And also to get some support for this, because trying to do it on your own, the pull is just what Darren said. The pull is to get down there and circle and try and manage and control, everything that's going on. So you
Because
have to have some support to be able to maintain those boundaries.
That's right.
And support, Al-Anon is a great support for that. And that's, doesn't cost money and is readily available, probably today on Zoom, but still available.
And there's so much that can only have the response of you need to take care of you, and you need support, and you need people that you can share this ugliness with.
Yeah.
Because that's so much part of the problem. Like, our kids are struggling, they're messy, they're stealing and robbing, and we're at tea with our friends, trying to not bring up this conversation, and
Yes,
just how much of that emotional process we're just burying, at every time that we don't have someone to talk to about it. It must be huge to live with that. And again, there's so many people and families that are in that position right now, they don't even know which way to go. Their instinct is to just deny and keep it a secret, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And again, like, here we are talking with an expert, Dr. Claudia Black. How many of your books are sort of in the beginning of that, like, where they can just sort of answer some questions or begin the conversations to sort of, bring the reader into asking these questions for themselves? I notice there's some workbooks. Are there some books that can just begin that conversation?
Yes. I think Straight Talk is a really important one. I think that Unspoken Legacy, which has been my most recent new book, it's about trauma and addiction in the context of the addicted family, will help pose questions. In terms of your own healing, repeat after me, but that's not going to help offer direction toward kids, but it's good for your own adult child healing, which can allow you to be emotionally healthier. A lot of people say it's like a great fourth step book. In terms of hanging on to your own integrity of recovery while you're dealing with problematic issues, I have a workbook called A Hole in the Sidewalk that I think many people will like. And then I have in December, It Will Never Happen to Me will come out with new revisions. So I actually have 15 books. So I think I just named 4 or 5 of those that I think would be the most relevant to our conversation today.
And where can one get all that information? Your website is?
My website is claudiablack.com. All my books are through Central Recovery Press, but just remember claudiablack.com. You can't purchase anything through my website. You have to go through the Central Recovery Press now. A lot of them are on Amazon, but you'll get the latest revisions through Central Recovery Press.
We have a few minutes left. I have a high-level question for you that I want to see if we can chat about. A hot topic for sure for some people. When you started writing your books, addiction healthcare has changed over the years. I remember about 5-6 years ago going to a conference and the big billboard said, "Your doctor understands addiction." And Suboxone had this booth that was the size of 20 booths. And the world of addiction healthcare treatment, there's recovery houses, there's so many treatment programs out there. How does we say here, being a mom or a dad is one of the most safety sensitive positions out there. And Safe Supply is taken over Canada. How does a family get through figuring out how to get well? It's like, there's so many models of treatment, short-term, long-term. Some people are being put on so much methadone and Suboxone that it's hard to get out of bed. And there's all this going on. Some feel like I shouldn't be on any medication to be a good mom. It's very complicated, and it's turning into very complicated. How do you navigate people through that, and without being like, throw everything up in the air, whatever lands on you, good luck.
Yes, yes. Well, that's the miracle question. How do you navigate it? Boy, I certainly empathize. I know that, in my program, we do a lot of education regarding what we call continuum of care, because usually short-term treatment in and of itself is not going to be the answer, that they're going to need sort of what we call step-down programs, as people take more accountability. And then all those dynamics, do you take sort of medicines that will reduce the craving? How long do you take them over the course of the years, et cetera? So I'm sort of repeating what your question is. How do you know where to go? I think one is that I would go with some kind of program or resource that has some history to it. When I say history, 20 years, 30 years, that I think that there needs to be people within that program that both have their own personal histories with this recovery, as well as those who may just be more formally trained. But even those formally trained, they are going to need to have somehow a personal compassion for what this is about. And, we can't ignore the economic struggles that influence the decisions that have to be made along this way. Typically, you would want any physician that is addiction medicine trained, and I know that there's a society in Canada, but even some of those doctors, are more into just medication and don't see the overall picture of somebody who's an addict. And so you want somebody who's been working in the field for a period of time, who's addiction medicine trained as well. And now you all, know your resources in Canada better than I do. So what resources quickly come to mind for you?
Well, each province has their own type of website that you go to. BC's very big right now on just stopping overdoses, and we're trying, even with our radio show, trying to keep recovery even a conversation. That picture you see behind me is Recovery Day, where we had 30,000 people show up, and so we're doing our best at trying to keep recovery at the forefront. But right now it's about stopping overdoses, and we feel like we need to stop addiction. But definitely there's the Canadian Center of Substance Use and Addiction, CCSA. The CSAM actually is having their conference today, the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine. It's good, but sometimes it's bad. Google is the place to go to now for healthcare. So I think Google's done a job in the last couple of years trying to verify addiction services out there. So they're doing a better job of it. But definitely the Canadian Center on Substance Abuse and Addiction and Substance Use and Addiction has lots of information that navigates. But right now with both of our countries, the US and Canada, there's just this whole conversation, stop overdoses. We started a hashtag called Stop Addiction because we need to do more than just stop overdoses.
Yes.
We're never going to stop overdoses if that's all we focus on. We need to build recovery capital in people and communities and healthcare systems. And like you say, take a look at the entire family. When I showed up to rehab 14 years ago now, I remember them asking me about my family, and I was just like, what for? like they're the problem. I don't want to talk about them. Years later, I realized it's just like, wow, how self-centered I was, and how family, like, we all need to heal together. And now I can talk to my mom, every Sunday, and there's no cloud. You know what I mean? It's just a conversation. There's no game. And I think that's what recovery does. And to any families that may be listening, I mean, that's like just let's all stop playing the game and having these agendas behind every question and all that. And that's part of recovery, not just not using. That's part of the recovery process.
Sorry, so am I here?
You're here.
Yes.
I just want to reiterate, Dr. Black's earlier comment. Like, we are spending a lot of time chasing the symptoms of a very complex and big problem. And we don't ever really talk about the education and the precursor to all of this damage, and how important it is to talk to the children at what probably a lot of people are thinking as too young, you know. And that I loved how you gave it an actual age, so people can start to wrap their head around these conversations that children can completely comprehend, or at least identify with the respect being given to them by having that conversation of important matters, of deep matters, of, you know, what we would deem as uncomfortable topics. And there's just not enough in schools. There's not enough education, because I think as a society, we think that it's too young, and we'll just let the parents deal with it. And it's sad. And I think that is a very, very important sort of message.
Yeah. Thank you, Darren. That's a really good summary. I wanted to go back and also say is that as you're reaching out for resources, and so widespread, it's like, you know, mud on a wall, where do you even begin? Go with reputable, and then also trust your gut. If it just doesn't make sense, doesn't feel right, you get more confused by things. Trust your gut. This may not be the right resource for you at that given time. But the other thing you have to do in this process of, okay, these people are reputable, this does make sense to me, though it's a bit overwhelming, and that is to be willing to let go of control, because there are people who are real experts in how to work with all of this, and you as a family member are not that expert.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Yeah, you're not the expert. Yeah, I love it. Even when I showed up to treatment, I had a treatment plan ready for the treatment center to give me treatment. I just think about how crazy
That's
that
right.
is. They're the same thing, but just 15 times later.
Yeah.
Claudia, thank you so much
Well,
for being
thank you
on
both.
the show. We met many years ago. I'm glad that we've been able to connect again via technology. It will never happen to you. One of many books Dr. Claudia Black has out there for families, addiction in the family, and what to do if you're a child of somebody who has a substance use disorder, and how to get through that, and how to break down and recover yourself from anything that may be going on for you. Claudia Black, thank you for being on the show. Darren, always good to see you. To all of our viewers and listeners, thank you. This is Talk Recovery Radio, live every Thursday, powered by New West Recovery, Canada's recovery capital. Thank you so much, Claudia.
Take care.
Goodbye. Truly my pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
My best to you all. Stay
Thank you.
safe. Bye.
Take care.